Like those filler words, like we all use them when we speak. They're, practically like the worst, man. How to eliminate filler words in your podcast without editing on this edition of Podcastification. My name is Kerry Green, and I am the client happiness guy at podcastfasttrack.com, and this is Podcastification. This show is all about podcasting. How to do it, how not to do it, best practices, interesting news items that have to do with the realm of podcasting, and who knows what else. And I'm trying to do it all with a little bit of fun and some information to help you get a show going, keep yours going, or make it better. And if you like what's going on here on the show, I would appreciate it, so appreciate it, if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes. You can find out how to do that at podcastfasttrack.com/review. That's enough of that kind of stuff. Let's get you podcastificated right away. Almost every person who speaks uses filler words of one kind or another. It's mostly done out of habit and without us even realizing that we're doing it. And when it comes to your podcast, those filler words can really become like irritating to your those people who listen to your show. So how do you cut out those habitual filler words? Well, that's what this episode is all about. Most of you don't know my whole story, and that's okay, but I'm about to fill you in on some of it. You see, for almost 20 years, I spent my life serving as a pastor in a local church. Now, the only reason that's important is that if you add up all the times I've spent in front of audiences, speaking, teaching, preaching, leading meetings, and all that kind of stuff, it's probably pretty close to the amount of words a woman uses in one day. No, there's research on that, I guarantee you. Anyway, I've had a lot of practice learning how not to use filler words. Now, that doesn't mean I'm in any way cured of the problem. It just means that I've learned some tricks to help me keep the filler words from filling those gaps in my speech that often get filled by filler words. And I'm about to tell you my top 6 tips to get rid of filler words. Are you ready? Here we go. Getting rid of filler words. Tip number 1. Assess your use of filler words. You can't get rid of something or stop doing something if you're not fully aware of its existence. So here are some ways you can go about analyzing how much you use filler words. Number 1, ask someone close to you to point out how you use filler words. And don't get angry with them when they tell you. Remember, you asked. Number 2, start paying attention to your own conversations and make note of the frequency of your filler words and what they are. Number 3, make a mental list of the words that you use to fill in spaces in your conversation and dialogue. And then number 4, prioritize those words. Which one do you want to get rid of first? Make a choice and file it away in your brain as the first candidate for your filler word elimination project, which I'm going to walk you through in just a minute. Now, once you've got all that figured out, you're ready to move on to tip number 2. Tip number 2 is this. Take a moment to understand the reasons behind your filler words. It's obvious that we don't use filler words because they're needed. So why do we use them? Well, I found 3 reasons. First of all, at times, our brains need time to catch up with our mouths. We just get talking way too fast. And our brains need the time to formulate the next sentence. So we throw in a filler word. The second reason we might use a filler word is that we use them to communicate that we're still thinking. Like when you're talking to someone, you say, I'm not too sure about that. Can I get back to you? You see, I used all those filler words to communicate to the person I'm speaking with that I'm not done thinking. I still have more to say. And with a podcast, that doesn't always apply unless you're doing a guest interview. So you need to be aware of that. The third reason I think that we use filler words, and the one I think is most common among podcasters and other people who speak in public, is this. We are uncomfortable with silence. That last one is huge. Silence feels negative to us. especially if we're the one providing the content that everyone else is supposed to be listening to, like in a speech or in a podcast. But the reality is that silence is not a negative thing. When it's appropriately timed and it's placed in the right place, like that one, silence is served to keep attention and to accentuate what we're saying. Now, we're going to focus on that a little more in a minute, but let's move on to tip number 3 right now. Tip number 3, prepare more. I learned this one in my own public speaking experience. It's like a math or science formula where one side of the equation always balances out the other. So there's 2 different ways you could say the equation. More preparation equals less filler words. Less preparation equals more filler words. It's always going to be that way. So ask yourself, how prepared am I? Now, I'm not suggesting that you script out every word of your podcast so you don't have any filler words. Though I have talked about some possible advantages to doing that, and that was in episode 7, which you can find by going to www.podcastfasttrack.com/podcastscript. What I am suggesting is that you feel entirely comfortable with the content you are going to be presenting. So know it, understand it, backwards and forwards. The better you know what you're talking about, the less you'll use filler words. And what if it's a guest interview? You can't be completely prepared in that case, can you? Well, that's where the next tip comes in. Tip number 4, accept that pausing is okay. Like I mentioned earlier, allowing some space between phrases or sentences, and even within sentences, can serve your communication better in many cases. You know, we've all heard the phrase dramatic pause. That's the point of what I'm saying here. Every person who is a public communicator has to recognize that none of us speaks nonstop with no pauses, unless you're like an 8-year-old girl. I mean, none of us are expected to speak that way. So allow yourself room for pauses. Allow yourself to believe that it's okay to have some silence in your presentation. And if when you're listening through it, you feel like there's too much silence, that's what editing's for. And I know in the title I said without editing, but that's the only mention of editing I'm going to say. So use those pauses to gather your thoughts, to consider how you're going to say the next sentence, to draw in your listener's attention through the pause. Don't let nerves or the notion that you've got to fill in every pause cause you to resort to filler words. This one takes some self-control, but I know you can do it. And I believe that if you take the time to learn how to use pauses, you can make your communication even better. I found a great resource that teaches you kind of how to use pauses, and it's at the changingminds.org website. You can find the direct link to it in this episode of the show notes for this episode. This episode of the show notes for this episode. Yeah, that's what I just said. In the show notes for this episode. And that's at podcastfasttrack.com/filler words. All right, let's move on to the next tip. Tip number 5.
Slow down.
Many public speakers, especially those new to the role of public speaking, speak far too fast. There's something about the setting and the pressure and the adrenaline that gets our mouths moving faster than our brains can formulate good sentences. And we talked about this a little bit already. You see, when that happens, our brain has to do something while it's figuring out what to say next. And since we're supposed to be speaking, a lot of the times our brain will make us continue speaking, but we speak filler words then. That's where they slip right in. Now, an easy solution for much of that is simply to slow down. Consciously learn to speak more slowly, more deliberately. You'll find the need for filler words will vanish most of the time when you do. All right, tip number 6. Start your filler word elimination project. So you remember back in tip number 1, I mentioned this filler word elimination project, and I suggested you decide on the one filler word you want to eliminate first. Maybe it's or like or something like that. Okay, you pick it out, and this is where that word is going to come into play. I want you to begin consciously listening for your use of that word, both in presentations like a podcast and in everyday speech. Now, whenever you hear it escape your lips in the course of everyday speech, pause, take a deep breath while you're setting your mind on not using that word, then restate the sentence or sentences without the filler word. As you do, you're going to be building a habit of not using that word, and you're going to set your mind to deliberately avoid that word. In other words, reinforce your desire not to say the word through making a conscious determination that that word will not victimize your communication. Now, that may sound a little woo or strange, but it works. Your mind is a powerfully effective tool in developing new patterns for your life. I mean, think about it. That's how you got into the habit of using filler words in the first place. Your mind subconsciously inserted them into your speech patterns without you even being aware of it. So just think how quickly you might be able to get rid of filler words if you consciously work on it. Now, that's my 6 tips for getting rid of filler words. Let me say one other thing. Don't stress out about it. Don't think your podcast audio is unpublishable just because you've got some filler words in there. It's not that big of a deal. It makes you sound more natural and more human, actually. But if you work on eliminating filler words, you'll come across much more professional, and I guarantee you, your listeners will enjoy your episodes more. So I've got 3 calls to action for you from this episode. Number 1, do you have any tips that you've discovered that have helped you get rid of filler words? If so, I'd love to hear them. So go on over to the show notes page at podcastfasttrack.com/filler words. And by the way, you can find that link in the notes on your podcast player on your smart device as well. And leave me a comment telling me what your tips are for getting rid of filler words. Secondly, if you've not left a rating or a review for Podcastification on iTunes, please do so. You can find out exactly how to do that at podcastfasttrack.com/review. And finally, if you've got a topic that you'd love for me to cover on a future episode, or if you've got a question about any aspect of podcasting, please let me hear it. You can email me at Carey, that's Carey, at podcastfasttrack.com. Thanks so much for listening. This show is brought to you by Podcast Fast Track, where my team provides professional podcasting services without the time suck. Full production, editing, and show notes, all in one monthly subscription package. You can find out more at podcastfasttrack.com. Now go out and make it a podcastificating day. And tip number 2 is this. Man, if I could talk without filler words, it'd be helpful.